The fact of the matter is that the social programs that Chavez has implemented, for instance, the scholarships for the students in the mission programs, the high school, the Robinson Mission, which is the literacy campaign, and the university students, they get scholarship money. That's not an example of handouts. An example of a handout is the proposal of Chavez's main opposition candidate, Rosales, in these last elections. Rosales stated 20% of the budget will be distributed equally among all the people, so that everybody will get, you know, a stipend from the government. That's an example of a handout, because people are being given something without necessarily doing anything. Fernando's point with regard to participation, that is also my main criticism, my main concern of the political dimension of the Chavez movement. Mobilization has been promoted, empowerment has been achieved to a great extent, but they haven't established mechanisms for discussion and debate. Nevertheless, I think it should be pointed out with regard to oil policy that Fernando mentioned, that this has never been a subject to national debate in Venezuela. And even though the discussion around the Constitution in 1999 was limited, Chavez stated, you know, I want this thing approved of or up for election by the end of the year, by the end of 1999. Some people thought it should have gone on. And the same thing with different discussions, for instance, the 49 laws that were passed in 2001. There was limited debate. But the fact of the matter is that there's never been debate over oil policy in Venezuela. And the fact of the matter is that the referendum in Venezuela, even though it had its limitations in time and the lack of open discussion around key issues, nevertheless, this is the first for Venezuela. This is the first throughout the world that you submit a reform. I don't know of any other country that's done this, a constitutional reform for election, in referendum form. In the past, the previous Constitution of 1961 was approved of in the Congress. The people didn't decide this, so that it seems to me that this is a step forward. It's got its limitations, but I think it's got to be recognized that, you know, this debate that took place last year over the reform was a vast improvement over previous legislation and the previous constitutions that were approved of. With regard to the union movement, this is also a very knotty issue. The UNT, which the gentleman who asked the question referred to, displaced the traditional trade union confederation, in Spanish federation, in English, the CTV. That dates back to the 1940s. And it was very promising. When the UNT was established in 2003, you know, it was a very promising development, because the CTV was completely discredited. It had participated in the coup against Chavez. It participated in the general strike that lasted 2 months. And the UNT was able to displace it throughout Venezuela. Nevertheless, it still has not held its first internal elections. It still doesn't have an elected president. It's got a national board of coordinators. And the key problem, you know, there's a lot of aspects to this, but the really key problem is the relationship between the labor movement and the government. I believe that the labor movement should be autonomous, but I believe that autonomy, that the best moment to have established that autonomy was after the referendum in 2004, when Chavez emerged as the undisputed leader in Venezuela with the opposition completely demoralized. Chavez had room to wage the struggle against corruption, promote internal democracy, and allow for a degree of autonomy. In 2008, Chavez's position is a lot weaker. And it's going to be a lot more difficult to wage these battles that are necessary. But I think it's got to be kept in mind that elections are coming up, as Greg mentioned. I think it's in November. They still haven't fixed the date, but they're coming up. And if the opposition succeeds in winning in those states in which the no vote triumphed in December of last year in the referendum, if they gain control of key states, the larger states, or not the larger geographically, but population-wise, they're going to use those spaces in order to really undermine Chavez's efforts. So I think that he's kind of up against the wall now. The independence, the autonomy people within organized labor, for instance, supports a reform on severance payment. Basically, they support going back to the system that existed before neoliberalism in the 1990s. And that is definitely a Chavez objective, but I think it's going to be difficult at this point to implement. So the debate that's going on within the labor movement, the Chavista labor movement, is between those Chavez leaders whose first loyalty is to the government and are thinking along more political lines, and those labor leaders coming from different ideological directions, but those labor leaders who are emphasizing trade union autonomy. With regard to the state governors that you mentioned, your question about the state governors, Greg is right. There are just two states that are controlled by the opposition. But I think you're referring to the fact that a lot of state governors are being questioned by the Chavistas themselves. And I said this during my presentation, that the weak spot of the Chavez movement politically is the state government and the local government. It's quite different. I don't know if people remember back some time ago the Euro-communist movement in Italy, where the Communist Party of Italy, which was breaking from the Soviet Union, was very successful in running state and local governments. And their argument for winning these local elections, such as in Rome, was, we do a better job than the Christian Democrats. In Venezuela, that hasn't been the case. And the Chavista movement is weakest at the local and state level. With regard to the bourgeoisie, I find that somewhat preposterous that this government in Venezuela is a bourgeois government. The Chamber of Commerce, called Fede Commerce in Venezuela, tried to overthrow Chavez a number of times. The coup against Chavez was led by Fede Commerce. The president of Venezuela for all of 2 days after Chavez returned to power was the president, no one less than the president of Fede Commerce, the Chamber of Commerce. Fede Commerce had never got involved in politics to that extent. Their position up until Chavez came to power was that we're a non-political organization. In 1948, there was a coup against a democratically elected government, and Betancourt, who was the ex-president, called on Fede Commerce to issue a statement in defense of the democratic government. And Fede Commerce said, we can't get involved in politics. That's not our role. Well, under Chavez, they tried to overthrow him, and they overthrew him in April of 2002. They came back just a few months later with a general strike, and the acting president of Fede Commerce this time led the general strike, and was one of the three leaders in the general strike against Chavez. So to call this government a bourgeois government, I think clashes with reality. And the last question I think I referred to with regard to the regionalization, and this has been, I believe, one of Chavez's successes in terms of uniting countries with differences ideologically. When you consider the differences between Lula and Kirchner and Vasquez in Uruguay, and the more radical wing, the more radical governments like Bolivia, now Ecuador, and Venezuela, and certainly Cuba, the fact that these countries have been able to unite, and along with them, countries like Peru, which is really a center-rightist government now under Alan Garcia, or at least a centrist government, and the government of Mexico condemning Colombia's position, I think it demonstrates the effectiveness of third world policies.